Hi, I'm Abby. I have a lot of records, and this is Vinyl Monday. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the series where once a week I sit down and just talk about a classic album I love. If 30-minute episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, both here on my channel and over on my Instagram. I have a couple announcements to make before we get this week's episode rolling, the first of which is that while I was at the Slowdive gig last week, yes, they were amazing. This channel hit 20,000 subscribers. Thank you so much for your continued support of Vinyl Monday, the loyalty of the viewer base that we've built over the past year and a half or so blows me away every day. Since I had this episode written before hitting the milestone, next week is going to be the 20,000 subscriber special. If you've been around here, you know what it is. Next on the docket, today, the day I'm posting this, October 2nd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, I'll be on the Hang Fire podcast. We'll be talking all things Rolling Stones. If you subscribe to the Hang Fire channel, linked in my description, and click the bell, you'll be notified when we go live. I'll see you there. On to this week's album. My usual subject matter is stuff from the 60s and the 70s. It's just what I have the most of in my collection, but from time to time, I'll spotlight a modern album. I do this when the album either has sonic ties to what I normally cover, has great cultural significance, or if it has great personal significance to me. We get to check off a couple of those boxes this week, plus it just keeps things fresh for me. When it gets a little colder and the leaves start to turn, I find myself revisiting the stuff on this week's album. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of Transatlanticism by Death Cab for Cutie. Congrats to those who guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints to what album I'll be covering next week. I host polls over there so you can choose what's going on. We just had one of those. It's a fun time. You can find that on my channel. All right, let's take the plastic off. I very rarely buy special presses or club editions like this one, but this pressing was just too gorgeous to pass up. This is the Vinyl Me Please 20th Anniversary Edition. It comes with this booklet of art that B-Roll Abby will be showing you throughout the video, and this beautiful dark red vinyl. I have a white slip mat on my turntable because colored vinyl just looks so good on that. We very rarely have colored vinyl on this series just because I don't have much of it, so when the opportunity arises, I'm usually gonna go for it. Before all of that, let's talk about this cover art. This is a piece by Addie Russell. Death Cab's drummer was her drum teacher, and she knew the execs of their label, Barsuk Records. This art represents the idea of the red string of fate. You might have also heard it as a golden string, or if you're a Taylor Swift fan, the invisible string. You're tied to your soulmate by a red string. However, in this art, the crow's red string is tangled around itself. He has no mate, and even if he did, since he's tangled up, he couldn't fly to meet her. Only when I really dug into Transatlanticism was when I realized just how genius of a representation this is for its subject matter. On Transatlanticism, we have what I'd call the classic era lineup of Death Cab for Cutie. We have Ben Gibbard on vocals, guitar, and serving as principal songwriter, Chris Walla on guitar and keys, Nick Harmer on bass, and Jason McGurr on drums. We have some special guests on this one: Sean Nelson, John Roderick, and Phil Wancher of Harvey Danger, The Long Winters, and Whiskeytown, respectively. They appear on the title track, rounding out the Barsuk Men's Choir, as they're credited on this record. This reminds me of CSN appearing as, definitely gonna have to read this one from my notes, the Lookout Mountain United Downstairs Choir on Joni Mitchell's Ladies of the Canyon. Transatlanticism was produced by Chris Walla. Roll transition. So to understand the significance of transatlanticism to Death Cab for Cutie, we must first understand, well, Death Cab for Cutie. They're a band we haven't had on this channel yet. Ben Gibbard was writing and performing solo under the Death Cab name for a while until he met Chris in college. They formed Death Cab the band when they were 20/21 years old and moved to Seattle. Flash forward a few years to 2001, which is really Death Cab's make or break year. Firstly, they're on their third drummer in 4 years. So you can see how this inability to hold a constant lineup could affect a band's ability to hold a strong bond. The making of the photo album was kind of a shit show. All the guys had quit their jobs to be in Death Cab, so there was this massive pressure to break even. And the tour's already been scheduled, so they kind of have to get this thing done ASAP. Getting this thing done ASAP isn't easy, though. Ben has writer's block. You have your whole life to write your first record. You write the second record, which was songs from the first record and new stuff you wrote, and then the difficult third. It's difficult because you have no songs and less time to write them. The photo album gets done, but no one's really happy with it. There's a lot of underbaked songs, according to Ben. But then someone working on teen drama The OC
What you say? Oh, that you only meant well.
buys a copy. A movie script ending is featured on the show. It and Death Cab blow the fuck up. Cue the band going mainstream. A movie script ending was absolutely not one of the underbaked songs on the photo album. 22 years later, it's still one of the best songs Ben's ever written. But if no one in Death Cab was really crazy about the record as a whole, then they're even less crazy about touring this thing. Which is a problem, because Death Cab gained a lot of new fans from the OC, and all of these kids bought tickets. One very notable thing happens during this touring cycle. Ben's going through a breakup. He's been on the road for so long that his relationship just kind of falls apart. Unravels, if you will. During all of this, Chris realizes that he doesn't like touring at all and is dealing with serious burnout. Tensions between Chris and the other guys simmer and simmer until it all boils over at the Baltimore show. They have this huge fight. So to prevent a permanent breakup, they all decide it's best if they see other people for a while. Ben moves to San Francisco for a time. He calls this his exile and the worst year of his life. He's taking odd jobs while he's out there, including house sitting for John Vanderslice while he's off hanging out with the Mountain Goats. Ben also used the Death Cab hiatus to form the Postal Service. They release one of the best records of the 2000s, Such Great Heights is another big hit, and they never do anything again. Working with Jimmy Tamborello really took Ben's songwriting to the next level. Meanwhile, Chris does more production work for a couple groups out of Portland. You might have heard of them. I don't know, maybe not. The Thermals and the fucking Decemberists. In this period of exile with Ben in California and the rest of the guys still in Washington, Ben got to contemplating the relationship between geographic and emotional borders. And he remembered seeing people saying goodbye to each other at Heathrow in London. He said, I had this fantastic idea of what if people were just able to transport themselves across the places or events that separated them. He writes a song about it, and to honor those strangers on those transatlantic flights, he names it Transatlanticism. The struggle and ultimate failure of Ben's relationship through the photo album cycle, his physical and emotional distance from his bandmates, plus this song he had, all took shape throughout 2002. The result? A concept album about the breakdown of a long-distance relationship. This actually isn't the first time long distance has come up for Death Cab. The music video for A Movie Script Ending is, well, a guy and a girl having their last hurrah before going long distance again. When Death Cab finally regroups in late 2002, their drummer decides not to come back. Enter their fourth drummer in 5 years, Jason. Things are definitely not all sunshine and rainbows with the rest of the guys yet, but Jason is super chill. He acts as the much-needed Switzerland in all this, the neutral party needed for the rest of Death Cab to patch things up. The photo album was recorded in a really short and stressful amount of time, so Death Cab was like, yeah, we're not doing that again. The best art comes from Strife, may be true for other bands we've had on this series, like the Rolling Stones or Smashing Pumpkins, not for Death Cab. Ben said about this topic, it makes for a better story, but when everyone's getting along and communicating and respecting their boundaries and musical desires, that's when you do your best work. Not when you're fighting and yelling at each other. Gee, someone should say that to Fleetwood Mac. Instead of grinding everything out in a handful of weeks, they take as much time as they need. What made recording Transatlanticism over a period of 6 months so easy is that, well, they owned the studio. Chris bought the House of Justice in Seattle in 2000, plus the band had ties to Tiny Telephone in San Francisco, the other studio they used. Chris worked there as an engineer. It's worth mentioning that Tiny Telephone was owned by who? That's right, John Vanderslice. In order to get Transatlanticism done, the rest of the guys prioritized Chris being happy and comfortable in his environment, and that meant using studios he called home. And they were great facilities. Hall of Justice is this teeny tiny wooden building on a triangle-shaped plot of land that had been used as a music studio since the 70s. And they still had all their analog equipment from then. Right now, in 2002/2003, we're seeing a shift from recording in analog to recording in digital. This makes Transatlanticism kind of a rare moment in music right now that will only become rarer in the decade to come. 12 songs were written for Transatlanticism, only one was left on the cutting room floor. Over the 6 months of production, it was just kinda never finished, and they had plenty of material for a double album anyway. The track listing of Transatlanticism goes as follows. Opening up the album, we have The New Year, followed by Lightness, and side 1 closes with Title and Registration. Opening up side 2, we have Expo 86, then The Sound of Settling, and disc 1 closes with Tiny Vessels. On side 3, we have the title track, Transatlanticism, and Passenger Seat. Opening up side 4, we have Death of an Interior Decorator, followed by We Looked Like Giants, and the album closes with A Lack of Color. Transatlanticism was released October 7th, 2003, 20 years ago this week. This thing was released at literally just the right time. This album and Death Cab as a whole became a vanguard of the indie rock boom of the 2000s. Now, indie rock is an umbrella term that even I struggle to define. It is so broad and it doesn't really have much of a consistent sound. But as far as bands go during this time, think like the Strokes, of course, the Shins, the Black Keys, the White Stripes, Interpol, and a little later on, Vampire Weekend and Arctic Monkeys. And that's just the more pop side of things. We could get into like Neutral Milk Hotel and Of Montreal for those minor, more folksy groups. Again, this is a huge umbrella term. The list just goes on and on and on. Anyway, Death Cab would ride this indie wave to mainstream success through the mid-2000s with the follow-up records plans, and narrow stairs. Transatlanticism was the genesis of that mainstream success. Critics and audiences alike loved this album upon release, especially with this new wave of online music publications. Ooh. As for the traditional print media guys, Christgau missed the point as per usual. All this buzz and this very well-timed boom meant that Transatlanticism was Death Cab's last record on Barsuck. They'd just gotten too big for an indie label to handle. Major labels were seeing dollar signs written all over and wage a fierce bidding war for Death Cab. Interscope battled for both Death Cab and the Postal Service, but in the end, Atlantic won the war. The details wouldn't be ironed out until 2005, though. Atlantic had to buy Death Cab out of the rest of the Barsuck deal. They'd signed for 6 records and only completed 4. Transatlanticism was re-released for its 10th anniversary with all of the demo recordings. I highly recommend seeking out the demos if you haven't already. It's fascinating seeing how these songs evolve. Today, Ben still knows this is one of his defining bodies of work. He's said something along the lines of "This and Give Up will be written on my tombstone," and I accept that. So, what do I think of Transatlanticism? Right, so here's the thing about Death Cab. I said earlier that this album checked a few of my covering modern records boxes, those being that it has great cultural significance and great personal significance to me. Transatlanticism very much does not check box number 1. This is about as far divorced from the tradition of my usual subject matter as we've ever been on this series. Yes, more than Black Midi, they're prog. Yes, more than Random Access Memories, that was funk, soul, disco, and yes, even more than Neutral Milk Hotel, that was folk. Death Cab for Cutie is entirely divorced of the rock and roll tradition. They have no roots in the blues, and they don't really fit into any of the other rock subgenres I've covered on this channel. They are straight up indie. Whatever that means, I myself am still trying to figure that out. Maybe we'll uncover some of those sonic elements as we proceed through this chapter of the video, maybe we won't. Whatever it is, it's feelings music, and that means that a lot of rock and roll dude bros won't give Death Cab or this album the time of day. What other distinctly feelings album have we had on this series? This was one of the best nights of my life, okay? I was this close to Neil Halstead, alright? I'm gonna use any excuse I can to bring Slowdive up. So Souvlaki found its way into Vinyl Monday because shoegaze has its roots in psych rock, but now, with Transatlanticism in the fray, it is no longer the only record featured on this series that I don't know how not to feel. Like Souvlaki was, Transatlanticism has proven to be very, very hard to objectively review because the music and the lyrics are evocative to an alarming degree. This record forces you to feel something, whether that something is poo-pooing it for how feelings-based it is, or totally falling in love with it for that reason. Going in, I have a soft spot for Death Cab. They were one of my favorite bands in high school. My favorite band back then was Rush, so you can imagine how cool I was. And yes, I was also a Postal Service girly, but I never listened to Transatlanticism the whole way through until now. Why? Because I came of age in the rise of streaming. You could shuffle, you could make playlists, you could pick and choose exactly what you wanted to hear, so I didn't know how to engage with a full album experience until I started collecting vinyl. And I didn't start collecting until college. And, as it was with Souvlaki, I've lived Transatlanticism a couple times, actually. As is increasingly common in our modern world, I've had a couple significant long-distance relationships in my adult life. And my best friend in the whole world lives in fucking Ireland, so I know the very acute pain of everyone who loves you being so far away. And for a number of New Years now, this album's opener, The New Year, has been the first song I listen to every January 1st. This year, I was violently hungover after hosting my annual New Year's Eve party and editing the Velvet Underground and Nico episode less than 24 hours before it was scheduled to go up, so that's how my 2023 started. Over the winter, while cooped up alone in my place, I was watching a lot of Tiny Desk and KEXP concerts. I watched Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros, Boy Genius, and all of its members solo. KEXP was how I discovered Black Midi, actually. But by far the most special KEXP set was Ben Gibbard's. This set was only supposed to be about a half hour long, but then he decided to take a couple requests. Audience members put a song title in a bowl, or maybe it was a hat, I don't remember which, and Ben pulled a title. If he didn't remember how the song went, then that person would get a free copy of the new Death Cab record. Ben decided to keep playing until there was a song he didn't know, but there just kind of wasn't. He just kept taking requests. This went on for almost an hour, and KEXP let him do it. That's his hometown radio station. To see how much these fans loved his work and how happily Ben was playing so much of it, that reignited my love for Ben's writing too. If there's anything that KEXP set made me realize, it's that Ben Gibbard is one of the great underrated songwriters of the past 25 years. There was not a bad song in that whole set. He's second only to John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats. Somebody get that guy his Nobel Prize already. But before I lose the plot any harder, let's talk about the album. Transatlanticism strikes a balance between the cozy and the cold, kinda like fall here in New England. It's got its fair share of intimate moments, like the drum machine on title and registration, the communal foot stomp hand claps on Sound of Settling. Those have me picturing a freshman dorm jam session with, like, altogether way too many people there. The velvety, rich sound of the piano and the crippling sincerity of the song Passenger Seat. We'll get to that, I promise. The cold elements feel watery, again, very Pacific Northwest. You have these loops running underneath songs throughout the record. The one on the title track feels particularly watery. The bright, open guitar tone still has so much free space in those twinklier moments. Overall, it sounds like Death Cab was shooting for the moon on this one. Did they know that they'd be on a major label within the next 2 years? I don't think so. But it sounds like they were aiming for it. Every concept album needs the exposition track. The New Year is a wonderful statement of intent for Transatlanticism. The lyrics tell us everything we need to know. I wish the world was flat like the old days, then I could travel just by folding a map. There'd be no airplanes or speed trains or freeways. There'd be no distance that could hold us back. Set against a raucous New Year's Eve party, we envision our narrator sitting on the front stoop, maybe having a smoke to escape the chaos and really sink into his feelings. Lightness is without a doubt the weakest track here, which is such a bummer to have this amazing momentum set forth by the new year squashed by lightness. The half-sung, half-cooed ooh-wows are the most delightfully 2000s thing here. This song serves more as atmosphere than anything. You know, seeing someone for the first time at a party and everything moves in slow motion. If I had to give one song on here to sum up how Ben writes, that would be Title and Registration. It starts out with this diaristic, blunt statement. The glove compartment isn't accurately named and everybody knows it. Over the course of the song, this quip becomes a metaphor for running into reminders of your lost love when you least expect it. Like when you get pulled over and you're rooting around for the papers in your car. Our narrator is using humor to cope. Ben's language is flowery and soft, articulating modern pain in very classical terms. This is how the men in our dreams write to us, right? Hang on to that for later. This cleverness happens again on Expo 86. Ben uses the image of a big metal slide at a fair to convey the ups and downs of a relationship. It seems by the time that I have figured what it's worth, the squeaking of our skin against the steel has gotten worse. This is such a painfully literal way to illustrate interpersonal friction. The Sound of Settling is the definition of happy music sad lyrics. The 2000s sure loved their cutesy, twee irony, and there's little more ironic than setting lyrics of existential dread against the most pop-oriented song on the record. It's very polished. See how cleaned up the guitars are and how the drums and bass fill everything out in a very plainer way. They fill in the valleys and round out the peaks. I loved this song in high school, and I appreciate it even more on the grand stage of this album, and now that I've actually listened to the lyrics. Don't come for me for this! Sometimes vinyl isn't always the best medium to experience the album. See in The Aeroplane Over the Sea breaking up Communist Daughter and Oh Comely, or Siamese Dream breaking up Spaceboy and Silverfuck. Transatlanticism joins that unfortunate club. My number one gripe about this album on vinyl is that it breaks up Tiny Vessels and the title track. This is a damn shame. An all-analog record deserves to shine on vinyl. This is a great sounding record, but that's just one of the limitations of this format. You have a finite amount of space on the disc to work with. In rock and roll, there are those 3-song runs that just make a great album, like Back in the USSR, Dear Prudence and Glass Onion on my favorite Beatles album, The White Album, or Deja Vu, Our House, and 4 and 20 on Deja Vu. Transatlanticism has one of those, starting with Tiny Vessels. This is the album's turning point, the moment our narrator realizes it's over and he's been faking it for a long time. Ben's writing is pretty objective, but it's got this quilt of flowery language over to soften it. The quilt slips to reveal the uncomfortably close at times, or the unsavory on this song. The repeated motif of "you are beautiful but you don't mean a thing to me" is a hard pill to swallow for sure. But then we hit this lyric. "So when you ask is something wrong, I think you're damn right there is, but we can't talk about it now." This is the most real phrasing we've gotten this entire time. To hear a phrase as blunt as "you're damn right there is," something that might come out of a real man's mouth, it just cleaves the record in half. On my first listen, after hearing this line, I had a pit in my stomach through the rest of the album. As we move together in the dark, move together is such a detached way to phrase this. It's the poet's way of saying, yeah, we fucked, but it's whatever. The coldness is almost shocking when you compare it to how emotionally involved the rest of this thing is. The lo-fi crunch of the bass and guitar is in stark contrast to the poppy polish tune before and the epic that follows. Then the title track, this cavalcade of grief that seems to goad you into crying. This was clearly meant to be the emotional climax of the record, even if, for me, it was the song before it. The thing with Death Cab songs is there's very rarely a moment of catharsis. This song ramps up and up and up by way of Jason's drums. He doesn't do anything showy, though. He just moves where the song flows. The song builds, and it crests, but it never breaks. It just unwinds with this gentle whir and leaves you in the expanse of this vacuous loop once again. Listening to the demo, you hear just how badly this song needed the rest of the band, and then some. You just can't beat the fullness the rest of the guys add, plus the guest vocalists. You especially can't beat Chris Walla's contributions. Oh my god, for his piano work alone, he's the MVP of this album, but then you add the production chops on top of that. Ben and Chris both really hit their strides as musicians, parallel to each other with Transatlanticism. And finally, Passenger Seat. The grandness of this album's negative space, the piano that has felt so big this entire time. For once, the negative space doesn't feel imposing. There's a crushing tenderness about it. It's lofty and sentimental, like the evergreen trees, shooting stars, and satellites written about. To put this, such a tender memory of when things were good, after the cruel vent of Tiny Vessels and the emotional onslaught of the title track, Death Cab, you are evil for this! From the lyrics alone, I well and truly had no idea what Death of Interior Decorator was about, so I turned to our supreme overlord, Google. I plugged in some vignettes from the lyrics to find out this song is basically a plot summary of a Woody Allen movie. Ben has thrown these literary/film homages into Death Cab Records before. In high school, I read and loved Wuthering Heights. I was obsessed with the song Kath, too. I was convinced that it was about Catherine Earnshaw. Lo and behold, 8 years later, I find out that Kath is in fact about Wuthering Heights. Ben, my love for you only grows. Having Death of an Interior Decorator on a concept album from the early 2000s about a long-distance relationship is intriguing as hell. The most obvious connection it has to the story is the end, where Eve walks into the ocean and unalives herself. It's a very dramatic way of doing that, very theatrical and pretty. I think this story is here to bolster the idea of the ocean being a straight-up villain on Transatlanticism. It splits lovers apart and it drives people to madness. It woke up and chose violence. We Looked Like Giants communicates the excitement of a secret new relationship through its whack-ass time signature driven by Jason's drums. It's math rocky and, yes, a little emo. It's hormonal and lusty, but not in a sexy way, like, at all. It's unabashedly earnest and kinda dorky. We looked like giants in the back of my gray subcompact as we fumbled to make contact while the others slept inside. This is the optimistic beginning of the story, the friends who become lovers behind the rest of the friend group's backs. I can't quite work out how these songs are supposed to fall in a chronological plot. I think it's supposed to be non-linear, like Getting Over Someone is. And finally, a lack of color. I heard the demo version before the album version, so all this time I've been singing the old lyrics. There's this intimate hum mimicking a tape whir, or perhaps the white noise in the background of a voicemail. And we have our second circular moment on Vinyl Monday in a row. The end of A Lack of Color is the beginning of the new year. This is my favorite concept album to come out of the 2000s. And maybe the best.
But Abby, what about American Idiot? What about The Black Parade?
Those are both rock operas, and while all rock operas are concept albums, not all concept albums are rock operas. But what about Tallahassee? Good point, actually. Transatlanticism bottled this ebb and flow, a pretty full breadth of emotion, from the blind optimism of Passenger to Tiny Vessels' spite, apathy from The Sound of Settling, Expo 86's whirlpool of confusion, and the guttural longing of New Year and the title track. What makes Transatlanticism so magical is this very fine line it walks between classical and modern. We have this very modern set of circumstances, a long-distance relationship, yet at the same time, it's really not. Lovers have been writing letters to each other across oceans for centuries. Hundreds of years before email, anyway. This is vintage yet modern, recorded in a 200-year-old meeting house with analog equipment. It's such a specific place in time, college in the Pacific Northwest in the early 2000s, and yet it still sounds so fresh and so easy and universal. This makes me nostalgic for times I never saw and wistful for the times I did, tears and vent sessions and all. Transatlanticism forever balances on a tightrope between past and present. For that, it's cinched modern classic status, tissue box in hand. My personal favorites are The New Year, Title and Registration, Tiny Vessels, Passenger Seat, and We Looked Like Giants. Remember, if you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That is Transatlanticism by Death Cab for Cutie, and I think this is only the second album from the 2000s we've had on this series. It was definitely the first 20th anniversary I've done, but what do you think of Transatlanticism? What do you think of Death Cab for Cutie? Or just indie rock as a whole? Does it get you? Does it not? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums I love. And remember, no matter what some guy on the internet might tell you, your opinion matters. And if you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you for the 20,000 subscriber special. Bye!